I think I know what military fame is. To be killed on the field of battle and have your name misspelled in newspapers. William T. Sherman.
Oh, hi. Mr. Lahasky here. And today, we'll fight the second half of the American Civil War and try to make sense of it all. When Abraham Lincoln took the oath of office in 1861, he inherited a collapsing nation. In his first inaugural address, he declared secession to be not only illegal, but invalid. He focused his efforts on restoring, or rather, preserving the Union. He managed to prevent 4 border states from joining the 11 slave states of the Confederacy, but would need victories on the battlefield in order to achieve his ultimate goal. Meanwhile, Confederate General-in-Chief Robert E. Lee proved himself a formidable opponent in the Eastern theater of the war, and he hoped that he could inspire foreign intervention on behalf of the South before the Confederacy's resources ran out. In September 1862, the opposing armies met on a field near Antietam Creek in Maryland. What ensued was the bloodiest single day in American history, and a battle that changed the war fundamentally. Today, we'll discuss how. But first, let's ask a big question. Was the Civil War worth its costs? More Americans died in the Civil War than any other foreign war. More even than World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam combined. The war cost billions of dollars to wage and resulted in billions more in property damage. The economy and infrastructure of the South was utterly decimated, and bitterness between the sections in some places remains to this day. Was it all worth it? Let's finish the war, then you decide. When we left off, the Battle of Antietam had ended in a tactical draw, though an extremely bloody one. Our first big idea outlines the significance of this battle. The Battle of Antietam opened Americans' eyes to the horrors of the Civil War, but closed the door for foreign intervention. Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation reframed Northern strategy and changed international perception of the war. In many ways, the Battle of Antietam was exactly what Lincoln had been waiting for, a chance to finally claim a military success. While the battle was technically a draw on the field, General Lee's retreat to Virginia allowed Lincoln to claim victory, since the North had repelled the invasion. Northern newspapers celebrated the achievement, and the president took advantage of the momentum by issuing the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which changed the very face of the war. The proclamation held that Lincoln would free all enslaved people in rebel territories as of January 1st, 1863. On New Year's Day, the official proclamation was issued as promised. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation has a lot of layers, and they're worth a closer look. First, we should note that the document did not actually free any slaves. That is to say, no enslaved person was able to walk off their plantation by virtue of Lincoln's proclamation alone. The Emancipation Proclamation only affected slaves in rebel territory. So enslaved people in the border states or Southern territory already secured by the Union were exempt from the order. The enslaved people that remained, those in active Confederate areas, were held captive by men and women who did not recognize Lincoln as their president. Accordingly, they ignored the order, and slavery continued. The proclamation also did not make slavery illegal. It was a war measure that Lincoln knew would not be permanent. What the proclamation did do, however, was order the army to liberate the enslaved as it moved through Confederate territory, which did ultimately result in the freedom of over 3 million African Americans in the South. But even beyond the freedom that it would eventually bring to millions in bondage, the Emancipation Proclamation had far-reaching effects. The Emancipation Proclamation reflects growth in Lincoln's own opinions on slavery and the war. He had announced at his inauguration that he had no intention to interfere with slavery where it existed. Yet, with this proclamation, he waged war on slavery directly. There are a couple reasons for this reversal. First, Remember that at the time of his inaugural, Lincoln was worried about losing the border states. By 1862, they were secure in the arms of the Union. Second, Lincoln recognized after a year at war that the Union and slavery had grown incompatible, and that the only way the Union could be preserved in the long term was through the elimination of slavery. After 1863, Lincoln's military and political maneuvering reflected this realization. Another thing we should note about the Emancipation Proclamation, it was extremely unpopular in the North. The main reason for this was that it served to reframe the war effort around the issue of slavery. While many white Northerners had been willing to fight and die in order to save democracy and the Union, far fewer were willing to make the same sacrifice to free black people from bondage. Abolitionists criticized the Emancipation Proclamation as well. They didn't like that the proclamation did not address slavery in the border states and other parts of the country. Lincoln had actually written the Emancipation Proclamation 6 months prior to its release, but his cabinet, recognizing how it would be received, implored him to wait until the Union could claim a military victory. Antietam had finally presented him that opportunity. But if Lincoln knew that the Emancipation Proclamation would be so unpopular, why did he issue it at all? Well, despite the blow to Lincoln's popularity, the proclamation was actually a stroke of strategic brilliance. The war, of course, had always been about slavery, but by publicly reframing the Northern war effort around that issue, Lincoln essentially eliminated any chance of foreign intervention on behalf of the Confederacy. Britain and France had long before outlawed slavery, and their citizens would never permit their governments to join a war about slavery on the side of the slaveholders. Cleverly, Lincoln eradicated Robert E. Lee's best hope for foreign help, forcing the South to carry out its war effort with only the resources it could muster. But Lincoln was not out of the woods. In order to continue waging his war for the Union and now the elimination of slavery, he needed to maintain public support. And in addition to the unpopular Emancipation Proclamation, another development served to temper Northern enthusiasm for the war. The Battle of Antietam served as a sobering dose of reality to Americans on both sides of the conflict. Largely, this is thanks to the rise of a new artistic medium and one bold journalist. Alexander Gardner was a noteworthy pioneer in the field of photojournalism. Gardner traveled to Antietam and photographed the battlefield just 2 days after the fighting had concluded. Many of the dead had not yet been buried or removed from the field. Gardner's photographs, which depicted shallow graves and mass carnage, were distributed widely. 18th century notions of war, which romanticized it as a rite of passage or an avenue for adventure, evaporated, leaving behind the brutal inhumanity of unspeakable violence. Gardner's work led many, especially in the North, to rethink their support for the type of war this was turning out to be. 1863 was a pivotal year in the war. The resolve of the North would be tested, as would its armies. Here's our second big idea. In 1863, the Union turned to new methods of recruitment and won 2 major victories in the field. However, Northern opposition to the war increased, threatening Lincoln's ability to pursue it. Abraham Lincoln faced new challenges in 1863. Robert E. Lee's army was still largely intact in Virginia, and the progress of the Union armies in the West was slow. And Lincoln soon found himself fighting 2 wars at once, one against the Confederacy and one in the court of public opinion. Lincoln's ability to pursue the war hinged on public support, and public support in the North, especially among white people, was waning. There were a number of reasons for this. Alexander Gardner's photographs at Antietam were enough to make any man think twice before signing up. Early enlistees were also finishing their tours of duty and returning home, sharing their horror stories of life in the Army. Compounding matters, the Emancipation Proclamation did not sit well with many white Northerners who cared not for racial equality. Lincoln believed he could rally support if his army could claim more victories on the battlefield. But for that, he needed more soldiers. To accomplish this, he turned to new and controversial measures. First, Lincoln opened the ranks to African American soldiers for the first time. While the Emancipation Proclamation had discouraged many white Northerners from signing up, it energized African Americans. The first ever black regiment was actually organized at Fort Scott, Kansas in 1862. But the first one officially authorized by Lincoln's government was the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, which was mustered into service in February 1863. Now, African Americans served in segregated units and initially were paid less than white soldiers of the same rank. They were also commanded exclusively by white officers. Still, over 200,000 African Americans would don the Union blue before the war's end. Women also played a more direct role in the Civil War than any previous military conflict. While female enlistment was prohibited, it's estimated that upwards of 400 disguised themselves as men in order to join the ranks. Thousands more served as logistical support and as nurses. Women served in leadership roles too. The reformer Dorothea Dix was named superintendent of Army nurses. Clara Barton served in a number of leadership positions before famously starting the Red Cross in 1869. And Harriet Tubman, a former conductor on the Underground Railroad, was a prolific spy for the Union Army. But enlistments were still not keeping up with the Army's needs. By March 1863, Lincoln's government was Conscription Act, the first wartime draft in U.S. history. But the draft was extremely controversial, thanks in no small part to provisions that allowed rich people to pay $300 to receive an exemption from military service. The draft amplified Northern opposition and even led to violence. In New York, a series of draft riots nearly required Lincoln to divert soldiers from the battlefield in order to restore law and order in the city. But despite the turmoil caused by the draft, the news wasn't all bad for Lincoln. Thanks to the bolstered forces, the United States scored major victories in July 1863. Robert E. Lee attempted a second invasion of Union territory during that summer. He was met by Union forces at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania on the 1st of July. After a 3-day battle, the largest and most deadly of the entire war, Lee was forced again to retreat to Virginia. The two sides suffered a combined 52,000 casualties, but Lincoln could again claim that the South had been repelled. Of much greater significance to the Union war effort was its victory at Vicksburg, Mississippi, the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. On July 4th, after a 48-day siege operation, Confederates in the city surrendered to U.S. General Ulysses S. Grant. The capture of Vicksburg secured the Mississippi River for Union forces, effectively cutting the Confederacy in half. Confederate resources were beginning to draw thin, and their prospects for victory were all but gone after Gettysburg and Vicksburg. What was yet unknown, however, was when and how the war would end. These Union victories were cause for celebration in the North, and the Army's efforts did engender a temporary boost in enthusiasm. But as casualty numbers continued to rise, and as Union progress in the field again slowed, the pressure on Lincoln to negotiate with the South increased, nearly costing him his job in the election of 1864. This is our third big idea. The war was the central issue of the election of 1864. Lincoln's opponent, George McClellan, appealed to the war's opponents by offering a negotiated peace with the South. Ultimately, Lincoln's cause was saved by a major Union victory in Georgia. Indeed, the Confederate war effort suffered strategic blows at Gettysburg and Vicksburg in 1863. Lee's army was hobbled and incapable of further offensives, and the loss of the Mississippi River was devastating to the Confederacy. Meanwhile, Southerners were running out of resources and facing their own internal conflicts. Like the Unions, the Confederate draft was extremely unpopular, and protests in the South intensified. Inflation devastated the Southern economy, and the Confederate government began confiscating private property in desperation. Though he recognized that the door for independence was closing, Jefferson Davis hoped that by continuing the fight, he could negotiate a return to the Union that would include the protection of slavery. And in the summer of 1864, this still appeared to be a strong possibility, especially if Lincoln were to be voted out of office. Remember, because Lincoln held that secession was invalid and the Confederacy illegitimate, he refused to negotiate with Southern leadership. Treaties are arrangements between independent nations, and according to Lincoln, the South was no nation. This meant that the only way out of the war for Lincoln was the unconditional surrender of the South. But despite the 1863 Union victories, the war still had no end in sight, and over the course of the next year, the Union armies progressed slowly through the South. In the North, the people grew increasingly impatient and fatigued, disillusioned by skyrocketing casualty numbers. Northern Democrats hoped to capitalize on these sentiments in the election of 1864 by supporting George B. McClellan for president. McClellan was a former Union general who butted heads with Lincoln in the war's early years. He appealed to Northern opponents of the war, known as Copperheads. He promised a negotiated peace with the South that would end the war and restore the Union. That negotiated peace would almost certainly include protections for slavery, which appealed to opponents of racial equality and the Emancipation Proclamation. By the summer of 1864, Lincoln's prospects for re-election seemed slim. He even acknowledged in an August letter to members of his cabinet that he did not expect to win the election, but he did promise to accept the results and work openly with the incoming administration. Fortunately for Lincoln, a turn of events on the battlefield helped to change his fate. Union forces under General William Tecumseh Sherman had begun a campaign through Georgia in May of 1864. Sherman was an innovative officer who turned conventional 19th century tactics on its ear. Famously, Sherman remarked, "War is cruelty. There is no use in trying to reform it. The crueler it is, the sooner it will be over." And Sherman lived up to these words. Rather than focus his efforts on the Confederate armies, Sherman waged war on the entire South. When his troops came across a cotton field, they burned it, because cotton was a source of income for the Confederacy. When they came across a cornfield, they burned it, because the corn was used to feed Confederate armies. They burned factories and destroyed railroads in order to eliminate Confederate supply chains. When Sherman encountered enslaved people, he liberated them, because they provided the labor that kept the Confederate machine churning. Sherman slashed and burned his way through Georgia, capturing Atlanta in September. Atlanta was the last remaining industrial center of the South, and the victory came at the perfect time for Lincoln, just weeks before the presidential election. Thanks to Sherman's campaign, which effectively split the Confederacy again, the end of the war was finally in sight. The good news saved Lincoln's election prospects too. He won decisively on Election Day, validating, in Lincoln's mind, his determination to pursue the war until the South surrendered completely. But Lincoln's work was not yet done. With the election behind him, the president turned his attention to political matters. He hoped to settle an issue that was yet unresolved: the future of slavery in the post-war United States. This is our fourth big idea. The 13th Amendment sealed the fate of slavery in the United States and was followed by the surrender of the South. The Civil War ended, and with it, slavery. Lincoln's re-election meant that the war would be waged until the South surrendered. But Lincoln had one major political goal to accomplish before that happened: the permanent abolition of slavery by constitutional amendment. Though millions of slaves had been liberated by the Union armies thanks to the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln knew that the proclamation was only a war measure and may be overturned in court after the war ended. He also recognized that public support for an abolition amendment might fade after the fighting stopped. So Lincoln used the momentum of his re-election to push for a constitutional amendment ending slavery for good. And he wanted it passed before the war ended. In January 1865, he saw it happen. The 13th Amendment held that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. The passage of the 13th Amendment was a major victory for Lincoln, and indeed the country. Codifying abolition in a constitutional amendment ensured that the end of the war would not bring questions about the continuance or future of slavery. It may also have convinced Southern leadership that their cause was indeed lost, and that the slaughter should finally end. Robert E. Lee recognized as much, and in April 1865, he surrendered to U.S. General-in-Chief Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. In the weeks that followed, other Confederate armies in the West followed suit. The Civil War was finally over. So, what did it all mean, and was it all worth it? All told, the war cost more than 650,000 lives and billions of dollars. As we've already seen, the aftershocks of the Civil War are still felt today. But the war also freed more than 4 million in bondage. And that's not to mention the untold millions of yet unborn African Americans who, thanks to the 13th Amendment, never had to endure the inhumanity of chattel slavery. The true purpose of the war, the true meaning of the war, was perhaps best articulated by Lincoln himself in November 1863, 3 months after the Union victory at Gettysburg and still 2 years before the war's end. The president traveled to the battlefield at Gettysburg in order to dedicate a cemetery to the fallen. He delivered a speech there that lasted just over 2 minutes. Today, it's widely considered Lincoln's masterpiece. Have a listen.
Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Next time, we'll take a look at the aftermath of the Civil War and ask how a nation can possibly move forward after such calamity. See you then.